and welcome to The Print. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor. And now, as the budget approaches, and even apart from the budget, there's a lot of talk on the economy. Are we slowing down? Are we the fastest growing economy? Are both of those things correct? Are there some structural issues with the economy, or is it just a cyclical slowdown? To discuss all of that, we have with you Dr. Ajit Ranade. He has been the chief economist at the Aditya Birla Group. He's been the vice chancellor at the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics. He is an absolutely noted economist in Indian policy circles. What he says carries a lot of weight. So thank you so much, Dr. Ranade, for joining us.
Thank you, sir, for the kind introduction.
Thank you, sir. So, as I laid the framework, what is your take? Between the club that is talking about India being the fastest growing major economy, and the other side saying that we're slowing down and this is worrisome. Where do you stand? Is there a matter of concern, basically?
We are definitely slowing down because last year the growth rate was 8.2%, and this year it may be, we still don't have the final numbers, but it may be around 6 or 6.5% at best. So it's a slowdown compared to last year. What we do next year is a matter of discussion and various predictions, but it looks likely that we will be also closer to 6.5 and not back to 8.2 as was the case last year. Now, but the fastest growing economy, I think we are barely ahead of others in the among the large economies. If you look at the G20, certainly 8.2 last year was the fastest number. And this year we may be just about faster than everybody else. So in that case, technically speaking, among the large economies, we remain the fastest growing. But the race, actually, the relevant race, I think, is not against other large countries. We have to maintain our own pace at a fairly healthy, large number, 7 or 7.5 at least, to be able to achieve the multiple goals that we have of inclusive growth, of increasing per capita incomes, of secure livelihoods, of social security, a variety of other things. So I think the concern should be that we have to maintain the pace irrespective of how other economies are doing.
Right, and so you feel that even next year, this 7% growth is unlikely.
Yeah, this year, because of various reasons, domestic as well as global, it's going to be very tough to maintain the kind of growth we saw last year. Coming closer to 8% is going to be very, very difficult.
Okay, so then do you feel that, again, the government keeps saying that this is a cyclical slowdown and that things will pick up soon, but others are saying that there are some structural issues that if they're not fixed, then, growth is not going to pick up. So what do you feel?
So this terminology of cyclical slowdown versus structural slowdown, I mean ups and downs, is actually comes from the classic textbooks which discuss business cycles. Right. So I think the cyclical slowdown simply says, I mean, to put it very simply, if there is over investment, let's say if you remember a few years ago, I guess 15 years ago, there was an over investment in the steel sector. There was a lot of exuberance, a lot of confidence, a lot of excitement. But then various companies came together and invested very heavily so that the capacity was huge. And then that overcapacity meant that the demand had to catch up before, and therefore there was price competition, undercutting, and so overinvestment due to exuberance and what we call coordination failure, because different private companies, private players are making their own decisions, but collectively it results in overinvestment, and therefore that leads to a slump period, and then it comes back up again when the capacity constraints are binding. So that story actually used to be more valid in the context of a developed economy where we have nearly full employment conditions.
Right.
For a developing economy like India, growing economy, actually the cyclical story, because business cycles did not make sense because we had a large sector, for example, labor in agriculture with low productivity or if not unemployment, underemployment. So there was huge potential for labor to migrate out of agriculture sector into services or industry, or from rural areas to urban areas, and that process could go on for quite some time without actually having this cyclical phenomenon of overinvestment leading to a slump. So that was true for India, but I guess now we are coming into a territory where perhaps that story, the developed economy story of cyclical phenomena is partially now relevant to India. So we do have to worry about the booms and busts caused by overinvestment and underinvestment. So for instance, in the cement sector, we have, I think, something like 420 million tons of capacity, but the actual usage is capacity utilization is only 70%. So we won't see any fresh new investment in new capacity until this capacity utilization keeps going up. So that is a phenomenon of a cyclical phenomenon. So I think maybe in some sectors there is cyclical phenomenon, but I would like to think that for the aggregate economy, it is still a structural story. So the structural story says that we have to increase growth rates by looking at the binding sectors or the binding constraints. For instance, some reforms, some deregulation, some liberalization in the factor market. So those are the actions which will cause growth rate to go up. And it's not the cyclical story which has to wait till the capacity utilization numbers come up again. It's a boom and bust kind of a story. Of course, as you know, just to complete this description, in a cyclical phenomenon, there are these anti-cyclical policies, counter-cyclical policies led by monetary and fiscal policies, which try to undo the effect of cyclicality. But I think in India, we are still most largely a structural story.
Okay, so now as we wait for the government to get moving on the reforms and especially the factor market reforms that they need to do, maybe we can look at the cyclical part of things. So you feel that the private sector not investing as much as, not investing with enthusiasm is right now because they've got overcapacity and the demand is just not catching up?
Yes, so this is the big story which has been around for now quite some time. That why is the private sector investment spending not picking up? As you know, the drivers of growth for India are consumption spending, which is a very large portion. Then there is investment spending both by the public sector and the private sector, and there is exports. Okay, so exports continue to be a very strong driver of growth, and we need to strengthen that further. On the consumer spending, we can perhaps talk about it later, but there is definitely a concern about slowdown in consumption spending. It's a large part of GDP. Now, investment spending, only a small part can come from the public sector, including the government, state and union government, as well as public sector undertakings and public sector companies. So, private sector investment is a huge part. I mean, I would like to say, I would like to think that if you want 8% growth, you need to have at least 35% of GDP as investment rate, around that number. And out of that 35%, perhaps something like as high as 27, 28% perhaps has to come from the private sector. So, and by the way, when I say private sector, it includes not only the large corporations, but also a very large, huge number of micro enterprises and household enterprises, as they're called. Right. So that has been the story. That growth is still not visible. And you can again tell a sectoral story, sector by sector. We can look at. I noticed that during Diwali time there was talk of large amount of unsold inventory of automobiles, passenger cars as well as maybe two-wheelers. So therefore, fresh capacity or new capacity in automobiles will have to wait. So private investment is forthcoming usually when they see demand revival, or they see good profitability, they see good export prospects, they see kind of consumer confidence. So there are a variety of factors, and they also are influenced by interest rates. But I just wanted to deliberately mention interest rates towards that, because I don't think interest rates alone cause private investment spending, including sectors like housing and construction and real estate, which are supposed to be more sensitive to interest rates. But it first of all depends on other macro conditions like revival of demand, profitability, consumer confidence, consumer sentiment, and so on.
Of course. So, okay, so then this inexorably takes us to the question of demand. What is happening there? Why is demand so sluggish? Why is it so subdued?
Yeah, so This is so now we're trying to diagnose the slowdown conditions. Why did GDP slow down from 8.2% to whatever 6% this year? And there are a variety of reasons. As I said in the beginning, there may be domestic reasons, there may be international reasons also. For instance, I think inflation, when it is high, it corrodes the purchasing power of households. It's a very
Right.
simple statement. So, and if income of households is not rising commensurately, and especially now, then you can start looking at the wage rates. See, the income of households typically comes from labor income. I mean, some households, of course, derive capital income. They have investments in the stock market or capital markets, but a large number of households depend on labor income. And labor incomes come from wage rates, even if it's casual labor or organized sector labor. And then, of course, there's self-employment. There are entrepreneurs. So there is evidence from the various data sets, including the PLFS, the Periodic Labor Force Survey, which shows that the wage rates, real wage rates, actually have been stagnant, have been very sluggish. And this is not just last 1 or 2 years. I can quote, I mean, there are various people who have looked at it. I can quote the research of Mr. Amit Basole and Anirban, his co-author, who have seen the data right from 2018 onwards. So the big macro fact is that the rate of growth of profits, and this is especially true in the last 2 3 years, that is post-COVID. There's also a research report by Motilal Oswal, I think Nikhil Gupta was the chief economist, which shows that the growth in profits have been much faster than growth in wages. So
Right.
profitability, they've looked at listed companies, but profits and wages, these are the two phenomena. And company balance sheets are healthier, companies are less leveraged, much leverage position is much better. So profit growth has been very good, but the wage growth has not been commensurate. This was also commented by the chief economic advisor, Dr. Anand
Right.
Nageshwaran. So to go back to your question about why is there a slowdown? Why is there a consumption slowdown? I think part of it is because household incomes have not kept pace with the GDP growth rate, which in the larger macro context, I don't know if it will convey the meaning. If you look at national income and its claim on national income by labor and capital in the classical economic textbook language, I think relatively capital has got a bigger share of income than labor. So that is
Okay.
what is manifesting, I think.
Right. So then what are companies doing with their money if they're not investing and they're not paying salaries and they are paring down their debt? What are they doing with all of these profits?
See, Sharad, when you say companies are not paying salaries, that is not a very fair statement because companies are also operating in competitive labor markets. So they will pay what the market will bear. So if there is surplus labor available, if there is availability of talent in the kind of talent that they're looking for, let's say at the lower end, unskilled labor, semi-skilled labor, and so on. So the wage growth is also reflecting demand and supply conditions. I mean, beyond that, of course, as the comment of the CEA, he urged companies to look at a more fair compensation to the workers and to management. Now, the word fair is beyond economics. What is fair and what is unfair? What is just and what is unjust?
Right.
What is morally correct from that? These are not the kind of things that you discuss in the economic context. I'm just saying that wage growth being sluggish is also, let us realize that this is also an economic phenomenon and reflects the supply and demand conditions. At the same time, companies also are always woeful. They're always crying that there's a shortage of talent, scarcity of talent. So at the higher within the labor markets, I think there's a duality. There's a divergence between what is going to high skilled workers, let's say people who are now adapted AI or machine language and data sciences or in high end, investment banking. Their salaries have not remained stagnant. So I think the divergence between a large class of workers who are relatively have lower skills or lower what we call quantum of human capital, their earnings and their wage rates are growing very slowly, whereas at the higher end, the smaller end, wages are rising faster. And you said, what are companies doing? Of course, as I said, the private investment is influenced by various conditions. What is their sense of demand revival? What is their sense of consumer confidence? So companies are probably aware that if consumer spending is not forthcoming, maybe we should be cautious about fresh investment. The chairman of Nestle is on record of having saying that he's worried that the middle class in India is shrinking. This is a statement by the chairman of Nestle
Yes.
and various other people. So urban spending, urban consumer spending is growing very sluggishly, and that is influencing decisions of fresh investments.
And RBI data actually shows that investments by Indian companies, investments that they make abroad, that has been rising quite sharply recently. So maybe that's what they're doing. Maybe they're investing abroad rather than in India.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the outbound FDI, the record shows, in fact, net FDI has fallen down sharply, and
Yes.
it's because not because gross FDI has fallen. Gross FDI also has fallen, but the net FDI is sharply lower. I think something like 56% lower, but it's because outbound FDI has increased. So there are growth and investment opportunities in different parts of the world, and Indian companies who are doing well are looking at global opportunities, which is a good thing. I think one can't, deny that they have they're there. I mean, if companies are looking at global opportunities, that is their prerogative, and that's a good thing. It's a sign of confidence of Indian companies.
Right. And so now coming back to this structural versus cyclical issue, uh, the private final consumption expenditure, basically the consumption data that was there in the government's first advanced estimates that just came out, that shows that private final consumption expenditure is expected to grow quite strongly. And I've spoken to some economists, and they say it's largely because rural consumption has been doing quite well. But rural consumption is so dependent on the monsoon. Isn't that a big risk for the economy? That if your consumption is being driven by rural and not by urban, then you're hostage to the season, to the weather, as it were.
Yeah, but I think the outlook for a good or normal monsoon is pretty good. And I must also mention quickly that while I quoted the Nestle chairman's statement, there is also analysis by people like Rama Bijapurkar,
Mhm.
whose theory is that we need to now start looking at beyond the marquee names like Nestle's or Hindustan
Right.
Lever and so on, because there are smaller brands, smaller companies, consumer good companies which are actually taking up this slack, and maybe their growth is complementing the slowdown in the bigger companies. But when you mentioned rural purchasing power, I think it's also supplemented by things like, first of all, the big, very big program of food security, which is giving 5 kilos of rice, wheat, or jowar, bajri, to every person, about 810 million people. Now that, when you get free food, well, in the sense that this is for food security, but that saves up some money to spend on something else. Then we have had a variety of schemes aimed at augmenting the spending power. Like for example, in Maharashtra, we had this Ladki Bahin scheme, which is a cash dole directly to women in their bank accounts, and similar schemes, cash. Cash dole has been operating in other states. I think Jharkhand and Madhya Pradesh and many other states. So that also augments purchasing power. I think it matters much more to the rural spender than, because as a proportion of their income, that is a significant increase for the rural spender. Then and therefore that manifests in better spending. So we'll have to see. It's true that the monsoon affects the fortunes of the rural economy. So it's possible that the consumer spending may revive. There are festival discounts. There are, I mentioned the large inventory, but this in December after Diwali, I think the growth rate has picked up in vehicles. So it remains to be seen. So this year, the calendar year 2025 may see some revival, because the growth rate last year, that is fiscal year 24-25, is substantially lower than 8.2. So compared to this, suppose we end up being 6.4, let's say, then next year may actually be 6.6. But it won't be a strong revival for other reasons. As I mentioned, there is this private investment spending has to pick up in a substantial way. Public spending cannot continue because it's facing fiscal limits. Interest rates are higher. Inflation is still not in a comfortable zone of 4%. And then, of course, there is the unpredictable, highly unpredictable outcome of what President Trump might do in terms of tariffs and other policies.
So, okay, so then my final question, I'll peg this this one to the upcoming budget, do you feel that it's a little bit time, at least for a little while, the government should stop focusing so strongly on things like the fiscal deficit and instead again open up its purse strings, because it's been government capital expenditure that has been driving growth in the last few years, and but this year it's cut back on its spending quite a bit. And so do you feel that for the upcoming year they need to again start spending strongly?
Well, Sharad, this is a difficult question because it's the I used to compare it to this batting style where you have to only hit between mid on and mid off.
Okay.
Who was the guy who was the straight bat to the commentator? Um, so it's like that. You have these two constraints that you cannot, by the way, ignore the fiscal constraints. India's debt to GDP ratio may not be maybe may not look that bad, especially when compared to developed countries which have 100% or higher. But large portion of that goes towards social security. Without social security, if India is hitting 80 or 90%, then it's a cause for worry. And even fiscal deficit 4.5 to 5%. The real concern is look at the servicing ratio, our debt servicing ratio. How much of our total budget goes simply to pay interest on the debt? Like 30-40% of revenues are simply going for that.
It does,
That
yes.
is the major worry. And on that count, India is a complete outlier compared to no other country in the world. It's such a high ratio. So we cannot ignore the fiscal aspect. But because we are a developing country, because we have young demography, because we expect to grow at 6, 7, 8% for a foreseeable future, the fact that we exceed our fiscal limits today can be compensated by future generations. That is a hope which always drives fiscal expansion. But I don't
Right.
think we can ignore fiscal. So I think I would say before we actually do fiscal expansion, we should seriously look at reprioritizing our expenditures. I think there is enough room to reprioritize and put it to use to more towards growth-inducing investments or especially enhancing human capital. I mentioned that while we have relatively high unemployment or low purchasing power among households, but companies are crying out for because of scarcity of talent. Now, why is there a talent shortage? Because human capital enhancement, our spending on education, skills, training is not adequate. That big part of it, I think, will have to come from public spending. Now, what happens is when you spend on human capital, kind of education, training, that is the benefits outstrip the electoral cycle. If you're just going to look at the next 4 year or 5 year cycle, the real benefits of higher human capital will actually perhaps come in the medium term. So almost always that gets lower priority. I mean, I'm saying we know that globally, India's spending on health and education is less than world averages, is far less than China. So I think we need to reprioritize our spending and cut down on spending, which is what can I say? Statues and the like. I mean, surely we need to seriously look at reprioritizing before we actually do fiscal expansion. And we also need to look at least filling vacancies when it comes to employment. There is something like an estimated 20 million vacancies waiting to be filled in both combined state and union government, including judicial vacancies. So even that will go a long way if we make that a priority.
Right, absolutely. But on that note, thank you so much, Dr. Ranade. This was a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.